Hello there and welcome to another edition of CopthallSoc Explains. Today we are going to be focusing on education and ideology. So what do we mean by ideology? Well, if you have been watching some of our earlier broadcasts, you'll be familiar with the concept of theory, perspective. Ideology is really another way of saying that, although it implies perhaps a more overtly political set of ideas. So we can see from this definition, it's defined as a way of thinking about the world, a set of ideas and beliefs, and one which usually then will instigate a certain kind of behavior or action. We are going to be focusing on the effect of ideology in education, and today we're going to look at three separate educational ideologies, all with their own very different way of thinking about what education is for, its purpose, and consequently how education should be organized. So let's remind ourselves of some of the main purposes of education. We touched on this in an earlier lecture on functionalist views of education. And perhaps the most obvious idea is just to pass on knowledge. We all know what schools are. They teach us things. We learn how to do quadratic equations, or that water boils at 100 degrees, or how an oxbow lake is formed, all manner of different things. Of course, sociologists are interested in some of the other ideas as well. Durkheim, we saw in a previous lecture, explained how education had the function of transmitting society's values. And of course there are various other explanations, various other functions of education as well, from the economic function of making the world work to actually somehow making us live in a society we want to be proud of, a better world, if you will. So we come to the first of our three ideologies. The New Right or neoliberal ideology is one where the main belief is that education is there to create a productive workforce. The role of education is to help support the economy. Consequently, they have ideas about competition and about the idea that we must ensure that market forces operate in the education system. What does that mean? It means that schools must all try to compete with each other, and the best schools will succeed, and the weakest schools will fail and be replaced. The impact on education can be seen right from the 1980s with the Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher, through the 90s and right through to today, and it would be probably true to say the New Right or neoliberal ideology has been the dominant ideology in education for the past 40 years. These tend to come and go in terms of popularity. The New Right or neoliberal ideology has really had a firm grip on education for a long time now. One of the key concepts, which we'll be looking at in more detail in a later lesson, is marketization. The idea that not only do we bring the ideas of competition into the marketplace, but we try to bring as many of those facets of a business world into education. Parents become consumers, and we try to make sure that schools are efficient in what they're trying to do. This is a controversial view, and it would only be fair to say that CopthallSoc's view does not tend to support the New Right view. It's hard to be a teacher and to not have views on these things. And I want to be clear that perhaps the discussion of these ideologies may occasionally edge into a little bias. Now, of course, the views of CopthallSoc do not have to be your views. And one of the key rewards of sociology is that you get to think for yourself. So, with that caveat that we might be a little biased here, we're going to move on to look at the second of our views. Not quite, because first of all we're going to look at some of the examples of New Right ideology in recent years. Academies and free schools have been set up really only for the last 6 or 7 years, and they're ways of trying to give greater control to schools themselves, and in the case of free schools, of parents who might be setting up the schools. Again, these are quite controversial. They have certainly benefits in that they tend to provide greater financing for schools, and we see these ideas of public-private finance and the public-private partnership as means of getting more money into schools, encouraging businesses to invest and donate to schools. As we will also talk about later on, there are some drawbacks here, and you might perhaps predict that sometimes businesses do not necessarily give away money for free, and there might be strings attached to money they supply to schools. In regards to the success of these new types of schools, it is really too early to tell. There have not been enough of them for long enough to have a good, clear picture of whether they improve standards. Early research does not show a particular improvement in standards, but time will tell quite how effective they are. So now we do move on to our second ideology, the social democratic ideology. And the main focus of a social democratic ideology is about improving the welfare of disadvantaged groups. For social democrats, the idea is that education is a tool to allow us to create a fairer, more equal world to live in. Consequently, the idea is that we should identify disadvantaged groups and focus on helping them. And as you can see, central to the idea of a social democratic ideology is this idea of compensatory education. This is the notion that we can direct our resources to certain disadvantaged groups, whether that be because of social class or ethnicity or gender, and use education to raise those students up to a higher level. The third ideology we'll focus on is variously called liberal or student-centered or progressive education. The key focus of this ideology is the student, that the child's needs should be of paramount importance. Forget the economy, forget making the world a better place, find what the individual student wants and meet that need. This is perhaps most famously seen in the school Summerhill, a school in East Anglia set up in the 1920s by the visionary educationalist A.S. Neal. His book on education is one that I have read many times and find absolutely inspiring as a teacher. If you know about Summerhill, what you'll know is that it's a school where the students make the rules. It's a very unusual model, but the whole focus is that students get to decide how the education system is going to work for them. Not surprisingly, again, this is hugely controversial. Some people believe the whole idea is rather flaky and hippie and nothing really gets done apart from people sitting around weaving baskets out of wool that they've sheared from their own sheep. But the upsides of this are that students get to develop a real love of learning. The idea is that education becomes something to be valued and enjoyed, and I'm afraid it is probably true to say that the school system we have for the main part in this country does not always leave students with that impression of education. Once again, of course, controversial, and certainly not everybody would support this, and indeed it's not been at all popular as an education ideology since the 1970s. The ultimate goal, of course, is that actually each individual, through a love of education, through a love of learning, becomes a person who will be able to contribute to the well-being of society overall. It's been suggested that this should have a huge range of benefits for students, not just helping an individual, but ultimately, perhaps more in line with a social democratic view, creating a better world. So, that brings us to the end of this broadcast on education ideology from CopthallSoc Explains. You might like to think about which of those perhaps appeals to you and which you think maybe has been your experience of education. Thank you very much for listening.